The morning mist hadn't completely dissipated when Marcus Thornwood parked his old blue Ford pickup truck on the muddy shoulder of the forest road, the same one he'd been driving for 32 years. The engine coughed twice before dying, as it always did, and he allowed himself a tired smile. Even the truck knew this was its last day. He got out of the vehicle with the slowness of someone carrying decades of hard work on their back, his knees cracking in protest, and took a deep breath of the damp, resinous air of the Oregon forests. Marcus was 57 years old, but his body seemed to belong to someone 10 years older. His hands were as thick as young oak trunks, marked by scars that told stories he preferred to forget. His face, weathered by sun and wind, had the texture of tree bark, and his blue eyes, once as bright as the summer sky, now carried the opacity of someone who had seen too much. He wore the same red and black plaid shirt he had worn on his first day of work, patched so many times that it was difficult to tell how much of the original fabric remained. Thornwood Lumber Company was a family business that his grandfather had founded in 1952, when the lumber industry was still the beating heart of that region. At the time, forests seemed endless, and chainsaws represented progress and prosperity. Marcus grew up among logs and sawmills, learned to identify tree species before he could read, and made his first cut at the age of 12, under the proud gaze of his father. Wood was in his blood, his grandfather said. It was his destiny. But times had changed. Environmental regulations tightened, contracts shrank, and large corporations swallowed up small family businesses one after another. Thornwood Lumber held out longer than most, but 3 years ago, after the sudden death of his father, Marcus discovered debts he never knew existed. He tried to hold on, laying off employees he'd known since childhood, selling equipment, mortgaging his own house. But it wasn't enough. The previous week, he had signed the papers to sell to Pacific Timber Corporation, a giant that would turn everything into numbers on a spreadsheet. That last day wasn't a legal or contractual requirement. Marcus simply needed to make one last cut. He needed to say goodbye to the only life he had ever known. He opened the pickup truck bed and retrieved his orange Husqvarna chainsaw, the same one his father had given him for his 21st birthday. The tool was impeccably maintained, the chain as sharp as the first day, the engine running with the smoothness of decades of attentive care. Marcus held it with both hands, feeling its familiar weight, the texture of the handle, the promise of power it represented. How many trees had he felled with it? Thousands, certainly, perhaps tens of thousands. Each one a small apocalypse, each fall a thunderclap that echoed through the forest. The trail leading to his destination was covered in damp leaves and fallen branches. Marcus knew it by heart, every curve, every protruding stone, every treacherous root. He walked slowly, not only because of the weight of the chainsaw and the stiffness in his knees, but because he wanted to memorize everything. The song of the birds that awoke with the rising sun, the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, the smell of wet earth and decaying wood. All these things that had always been there, that he had always taken for granted, now seemed as precious as gold. After a 20-minute walk, he arrived at the small valley where his tree awaited him. It wasn't the largest in the region, nor the most commercially valuable. It was a Douglas fir, about 80 years old, standing solitary in a natural clearing, its upper branches reaching for the sky like pleading arms. Marcus had been visiting that tree for years, always resisting the temptation to cut it down. I didn't know exactly why. Perhaps because it reminded him of when the forests seemed magical, before they became just inventory. Perhaps because it was outside the official logging areas, on a piece of land that technically belonged to the family, but had never been exploited. Or perhaps simply because somewhere deep and inexplicable in his soul, he loved that tree. And now, on the last day, he had come to overthrow her. Marcus placed the chainsaw on the ground and approached the trunk. The bark was rough under his fingers, alive in a way that metal never could be. He circled the tree slowly, assessing the angle of fall, checking for dead branches that might fall prematurely, reading the wood as a scholar would read an ancient manuscript. 32 years of experience had made these calculations instinctive, but he forced himself to think through each step, to be completely present. Why was he doing this? The question pierced his mind like a thorn. The tree wasn't worth much on the market, and he no longer had a company to profit from it. Technically, that land would soon belong to Pacific Timber, which would inevitably cut it down anyway. But there was something more, something he could barely articulate to himself. Perhaps he needed to prove that he was still who he had always been. Perhaps he needed one last act of control in a world that had completely slipped from his grasp. Or perhaps, more darkly, he wanted to destroy the only beautiful thing that remained before others could. He picked up the chainsaw, pumped in the fuel, and pulled the starter cord. The engine roared to life, a sound he knew better than his own voice. Marcus positioned himself, adjusted his feet, and pressed the blade against the bark at the base. Wood chips began to fly. The smell of fresh sap filled the air. The tree trembled slightly, like an animal feeling the first touch of a butcher's knife. And then he stopped. Marcus turned off the chainsaw. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by his own racing heart. He took a step back, then another, until he was a considerable distance from the tree. His hands trembled, not from tiredness, but from something he couldn't name. Anger, sadness, shame. He sat heavily on the damp ground, leaning his back against a fallen, moss-covered log. The chainsaw lay uselessly beside him. Marcus looked at the tree, at the small notch he had made at its base, a superficial wound that would heal with time. And then, to his own surprise, he began to cry. It wasn't a discreet cry. They were deep, convulsive sobs that came from a place he had kept locked away for decades. He cried for the company he had lost, for the inheritance he hadn't been able to preserve, for the employees he had let go. He cried for his father, who had died believing his son would keep the family dream alive. He cried for his wife, who had left him 15 years ago, tired of competing with trees for his attention. He cried for his children who had pursued careers in the cities and rarely called. But more than anything, he cried for himself, for the man who had spent a lifetime cutting things down without ever building anything, for the worker who had destroyed forests in the name of progress without questioning whether that progress even existed. How long did he lie there, lost in his private grief? It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have lost its meaning. When he finally regained his composure, the sun was already high, filtering through the treetops in golden rays that made the dust dance in the air. Marcus wiped his face with the back of his dirty hands and forced himself to stand. That's when he heard the voices. Multiple human voices approached from the trail he had come by. Marcus frowned. That area was private, and no one should be there. He picked up the chainsaw and walked toward the sounds, each step increasing his confusion. When he emerged onto the trail, he found a group of about 15 people. They were mostly young, wearing expensive hiking clothes and carrying technical backpacks. Some carried professional cameras. A blonde woman at the front of the group, perhaps in her 30s, held a tablet and gestured animatedly. She was the first to notice Marcus. "Oh!" she exclaimed, stopping abruptly. The entire group froze behind her. "You must be Marcus Thornwood." Marcus stared at her, completely bewildered. "Who's asking? And how the hell did you get onto my property?" The woman smiled, but it was a nervous smile. "My name is Jennifer Hartley. I'm a documentary producer. We heard about the sale of Thornwood lumber, and we're making a film about the decline of the family-run lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest. We've tried to contact you several times, but—" "I never answered," Marcus finished. his voice rough. Because I don't want cameras in my face while I lose everything I've built. Jennifer stepped forward, her hands raised in a conciliatory gesture. I understand, Mr. Thornwood. I truly understand. But your story is important. Your family's story represents something bigger, the end of an era. People need to know what is being lost, not just in terms of businesses, but in terms of tradition, knowledge, and community. People? Marcus gave a bitter laugh. People in cities who buy their wooden tables at IKEA and post pictures of trees on Instagram? Those people? A young man in the group, no more than 25 years old, with a trimmed goatee and a sweatshirt bearing a university logo, stepped forward. Actually, Mr. Thornwood, many of us care deeply about environmental justice and the communities that have been exploited by the extractive industry. We're not here to glamorize logging. We're here to document the complexities, including the human costs of the economic transition. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest like bile. Human costs of economic transition, he repeated, savoring each word with sarcasm. Is that what I am now? A statistic in your doctoral thesis? That's not what he meant, Jennifer interjected quickly. Marcus, can I call you Marcus? We really want to do justice to your story. We're not your enemies. No. Marcus gestured with the chainsaw, causing some members of the group to back away. You're not my enemies. People like you, with your regulations and your Save the Trees campaigns, are exactly why my company went bankrupt. Not because I was a bad businessman, not because I didn't work hard, but because you decided that trees are worth more than people. An older woman in the group, perhaps in her 50s, with grey hair tied in a bun, spoke in a calm voice. With all due respect, Mr. Thornwood, trees are life too. These forests are complete ecosystems, home to thousands of species. Uncontrolled logging is not sustainable. You should know that. Sustainable. Marcus spat out the word. My family has been in this business for 70 years. 70. We replanted, managed, and cared for this land. We weren't monsters destroying everything out of greed. We were workers trying to survive. But what about the spotted owl? The young man in the sweatshirt asked. And the salmon that depend on the streams destroyed by erosion from logging? And what about the climate change caused by deforestation? Marcus felt something break inside him. You want to talk about climate change? My grandfather used to take me fishing in that river over there. He pointed vaguely eastward. We'd catch salmon the size of my arm. Today, you're lucky if you find a small fish. And you know why? It wasn't the cutting down of trees. It was the dams your big energy companies built. It was the chemicals your industrial farms dumped. It was the changes that came from the cities, not the forests. You're right, Jennifer said softly. There are multiple factors, and that's exactly why we want to tell complete, nuanced stories, including yours. Marcus remained silent for a long moment, looking at the group of strangers who had invaded what should have been his private farewell. He could send them away. He could threaten them with the chainsaw, call the police for trespassing. But looking at their faces, he saw something he hadn't expected. Genuine curiosity, yes, but also something like concern. They didn't seem like the monsters he had imagined, the radical activists who chained themselves to trees and sabotaged equipment. They just seemed like people, trying to understand a world as complicated as his own. What do you want from me? He finally asked, too tired to hold on to his anger. Just a conversation, Jennifer said. Tell us about your family, about the company, about what you're missing. Show us what you do. We won't edit it to make you look like a villain, I promise. Marcus looked back at the lone tree waiting in the clearing. I was about to cut down a tree. My last cut, but... He hesitated, the words difficult to form. But I don't think I can. Why not? The grey-haired woman asked, with genuine interest. Marcus sighed. Because I've spent my whole life cutting down trees without really looking at them. And that one over there, it was always different. I kept it standing all these years, and now, at the end, I thought I needed to cut it down. To prove something, maybe. But when I started, I realized I would be destroying the only thing that still means something. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't hostile or uncomfortable, but contemplative. Jennifer finally spoke. "Can you show us the tree?" Marcus considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, you can come." He led them along the trail to the clearing. When the tree came into view, there were appreciative murmurs from the group. Someone started taking pictures. The cameraman started filming. Marcus watched as they circled the tree, touching its bark, looking up through its branches. Seeing it through their eyes, he realized how truly majestic it was. Not just commercial timber, but a living being that had existed long before he was born, and if he was lucky, would exist long after his death. "She's beautiful," Jennifer said, touching the small notch Marcus had made. "Were you really planning on cutting it?" "I was," Marcus admitted. "But I don't know if it was what I really wanted, or if it was just, I don't know, anger, despair, an attempt to control something in a world that I feel I no longer control." The young man in the sweatshirt approached. "Can I ask you something? Do you feel remorse for the trees you've cut down over the years?" The question was direct, almost brutal in its honesty. Marcus appreciated that. He thought carefully before answering. "Remorse is a complicated word. I did what I thought was right at the time. I supported my family, employed people from the community, provided materials that built houses and schools. But looking back now..." He paused, searching for words. "I don't think I ever really thought about what I was doing. To me, trees were resources, not living beings. And maybe that was a mistake." "And now?" the gray-haired woman asked. "What are you going to do with this tree?" Marcus looked at her, then at the tree, then at the group of strangers who were somehow witnessing the most vulnerable moment of his life. "I think I'll leave it standing. Not because you're here, not because I want to seem noble, but because it deserves to live. And because maybe, just maybe, I need to let something grow instead of always cutting it down." Jennifer smiled, and this time there was nothing nervous about it. "Can I film you saying that?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. He had never been good with words, and the idea of being on camera made him deeply uncomfortable. But perhaps his story, with all its contradictions and flaws, needed to be told. They spent the next 2 hours talking. Marcus spoke about his grandfather, about growing up in the forest, about the pride of continuing a family tradition. He spoke about the difficulties of the last few years, about watching employees of decades lose their jobs, about the powerlessness of signing papers that handed everything over to an anonymous corporation. He was honest about his frustrations with environmental regulations, but also admitted that perhaps he hadn't paid enough attention to the impacts of his actions. The group, in turn, asked respectful questions. They didn't try to judge him, didn't paint him as a villain or a hero, they just tried to understand. The young man in the sweatshirt, whose name was Tyler, and who was doing a master's degree in environmental studies, spoke about how the transition to a more sustainable economy needed to include real support for displaced workers, not just empty rhetoric. The grey-haired woman, Margaret, who was a biologist, gently explained the importance of biodiversity, but also acknowledged that conservationists didn't always adequately consider the human impact of their policies. Marcus discovered that he didn't agree with everything people were saying, but for the first time in years, he was having a real conversation about these issues, not just shouting in echo chambers. He realized that his views of environmentalists as monolithic enemies were as simplistic as the view many had of loggers as greedy destroyers. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jennifer turned off the cameras. Marcus, thank you. Thank you for your honesty, for your vulnerability. This will mean a lot to the documentary. Marcus nodded, suddenly exhausted. What's going to happen now? With the film, I mean. We'll spend the next few months editing, interviewing other people, building the narrative. We hope to launch it on the festival circuit next year, but I'll keep you informed every step of the way, and you'll have final approval on how your story is told. That's important to me. And this tree? Marcus asked, looking at it. Pacific Timber will take over in 2 weeks. They're going to cut it down. Jennifer exchanged glances with the group members. What if they didn't cut it? What if there was a way to protect this area? Tyler stepped forward excitedly. There are organizations that buy land for conservation. If we could do a campaign, raise funds, maybe we could buy this specific parcel before Pacific takes it. Not the whole property, but this area here. We could create a small reserve, maybe even put up a plaque telling the story of the tree and its family. Marcus felt something strange in his chest, something he took a while to recognize as hope. Would you do this? We could try, Margaret said. I can't promise anything, but with the story we filmed today, with the attention the documentary will bring, perhaps we can mobilize enough support. But why? Marcus asked, genuinely confused. It's not just one tree among millions, Jennifer smiled, because it's not just about a tree. It's about the possibility of change, of redemption, of finding a different path. Your story, Marcus, the story of a man who spent his life cutting down trees but chose to leave one standing. That's powerful. That makes people think. Marcus looked at the tree once more, its silhouette outlined against the twilight sky. It had been there before he was born, a silent witness to generations. And perhaps, if they were lucky, it would remain there for generations to come. All right, he said, let's try, but I don't want empty promises. I want to see real plans, real numbers. I'm not interested in feelings. I'm interested in results. Fair enough, Jennifer agreed. She extended her hand, and Marcus shook it. Her palm was soft compared to his, hands that had worked with keyboards instead of chainsaws, but the grip was firm, full of determination. The group began preparing to leave, packing equipment and adjusting backpacks. Marcus watched them, this unlikely group of allies who had appeared on what was supposed to be his last day. He didn't know if their campaign would succeed. He didn't know if the tree would survive or if Pacific Timber would simply cut it down despite all efforts. The world was complicated and happy endings were rare. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt he wasn't just reacting, just surviving day after day. He was choosing something. He was taking a stand, not against people, but for something he believed in. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. When the last member of the group disappeared down the trail, Marcus was alone once more. He approached the tree and placed his hand on the trunk, feeling the texture of the bark under his calloused fingers. The notch he had made earlier was small, insignificant in the grand scheme of the tree's life. It would heal. It would go on. Sorry, he murmured, unsure if he was speaking to the tree, his grandfather, his father, or some younger version of himself. Sorry for almost doing that. The tree did not answer, of course, but Marcus felt, or imagined feeling, a slight swaying in its branches, as if the wind were whispering absolution. He grabbed his chainsaw and began the walk back to the pickup truck. Each step was lighter than the last, as if a weight he had carried for decades was slowly dissolving. The sky was dark now, but he knew the way by heart. He always had. When he reached the vehicle, Marcus carefully, almost reverently, placed the chainsaw in the truck bed. It had served him well all these years, a faithful companion through thousands of working days. He didn't know if he would ever use it again. Part of him hoped he wouldn't. Marcus got into the cab and turned the key. The engine coughed, protested, but eventually started. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the dark forest behind him, at the invisible trail leading to the tree he had chosen to spare. Then he set the vehicle in motion and drove home. In the weeks that followed, Marcus watched with growing surprise as Jennifer's campaign gained traction. Their video went viral on social media. Thousands of people donated small amounts. An environmental foundation offered to match the donations. Local newspapers picked up the story. A national talk show host mentioned it on his program. Marcus's tree, which he had almost felled in a moment of desperation, became a symbol of something bigger than him or anyone involved. Pacific Timber, facing a public relations storm, agreed to sell that particular parcel of land to a conservation organization for a reasonable price. They even made a marketing opportunity out of it, positioning themselves as a company that balances economic development with environmental responsibility. Marcus found the hypocrisy almost funny, but he didn't care. The outcome was what mattered. 3 months later, on a cool spring morning, a ceremony was held in the clearing. Local officials attended, as well as members of the documentary crew, some major donors, and even some of Marcus's former employees. A bronze plaque was installed near the tree, telling its story and the story of the Thornwood Lumber Company. It didn't romanticize the past or judge the choices made. It simply told the truth in all its complexity. Marcus was there, uncomfortable with all the attention, but grateful nonetheless. He gave a short speech, thanking everyone involved, talking about his father and grandfather, about the meaning of work and the land. He finished by saying something he had thought a lot about in recent weeks. My whole life, I defined success by what I could tear down, by what I could build on top of the ruins of what I removed. That was the job, that's what men did. But I'm learning, perhaps too late, that sometimes the greatest act of courage and strength is choosing not to destroy. It's protecting. It's letting something exist simply because it deserves to exist, not because it serves some purpose for us. This tree will outlive us all, and that, in some strange way, gives me hope. There was applause. Some people wiped away tears. Marcus climbed down from the small makeshift platform and went straight to the tree, escaping the attention as quickly as he could. He placed his hand on the trunk, and after everyone had eventually dispersed, he stood there alone once more. "We did it," he whispered. "You're safe now." Marcus didn't believe trees could hear or understand human language. He was a practical man, raised on facts and logic. But at that moment, he swore he felt the tree respond, its deep roots conveying some ancient, wordless message of gratitude and continuity. He stood there until the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold. Then finally he turned and walked back to the pickup truck, but this time it wasn't goodbye. It was just see you later. Marcus would visit that tree many more times in the years to come. Sometimes he would take his grandchildren, whom he rarely saw, telling them stories of their grandfather and great-grandfather, teaching them to identify species, to listen to birdsong, to respect the forest. Other times, he would go alone, just to sit and think, finding a peace he never knew was possible. Jennifer's documentary premiered the following year and won awards. Marcus watched it at the local cinema, surrounded by neighbors and strangers, seeing his life distilled into 90 minutes of film. It wasn't perfect, and some parts made him cringe with embarrassment, but it was honest. He could live with that. He never went back to the timber business. With the money from sales and occasional consulting for companies that wanted to improve their environmental practices, he managed to pay the bills. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was a life. And unlike the one he had lived before, this one included time for reflection, for connection, for simply existing without always producing or destroying something. Marcus died at 73. Peacefully in his sleep, during a harsh winter when the forest was silent under the snow. His funeral was small, but meaningful. Jennifer was there, as were Tyler and Margaret, now true friends after years of collaborating on conservation projects. His children came from the cities, bringing the grandchildren he had come to know better in recent years. Former Thornwood lumber employees attended, some still bitter about losing their jobs, but most having found new paths and ready to celebrate the man he had been in all his complexity. They buried him in the local cemetery under a grey sky heavy with unfallen snow. The pastor spoke fitting words about work and dignity, about change and growth. But it was Tyler, surprisingly, who asked to speak, and best captured the essence of Marcus. "I met Marcus Thornwood on a day when he was about to commit an act he would regret for the rest of his life," Tyler began, his voice firm despite the emotion. "I was an arrogant student, full of theories and judgments. He was a man at the end of his rope, trying to make sense of a world that had changed around him. That day, we both learned something important. I learned that people are not their occupations. They are not villains in simple narratives. And Marcus learned that change doesn't mean failure, that letting something grow can be as meaningful as building something new." He paused, looking at the coffin. Marcus wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, just like we all do. But he had the courage to acknowledge that, to change, to choose a different path even when it was most difficult. The tree he spared is still there, taller and stronger each year, and I like to think it's more than just a tree. It's a testament to the fact that it's never too late to make the right choice. After the funeral, a small group made the trek to the clearing. The snow made the journey difficult, but Marcus would have appreciated it. He always said that nothing of value comes easy. When they reached the tree, it stood magnificent against the winter sky, its bare branches outstretched like natural sculptures, covered by a thin layer of ice that glistened with faint light. Marcus's daughter, Sarah, whom he had barely seen during the bitter years of bankruptcy, but with whom he had reconciled at the end, placed her hand on the trunk. "He came here every week for the last few years," she said softly. "Sometimes he would call me afterwards, talk about what he was thinking. I think this tree helped him find peace." "She helped a lot of people," Jennifer added. "We constantly receive letters from people who watched the documentary and were inspired to make changes in their own lives. Small changes most of the time, but significant ones. One of Marcus's grandsons, a 12-year-old boy named James, looked up through the branches. Grandpa taught me about trees. He said that each one has a story if you stop to listen. He said he spent a lot of time not listening, but he was trying to make up for it." They stood there in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts, united only by their shared presence and the legacy of the man who had brought them together. The snow began to fall, large, soft flakes that landed on their hair and shoulders without immediately melting. Margaret broke the silence. "You know the foundation is expanding the program. We're working with other logging communities, trying to create pathways for economic transition that don't leave people behind. Marcus helped shape that. His insights, his honesty about the difficulties, made our work more effective. He would be happy to know that," Sarah said. "In the end, I think he just wanted his suffering to mean something, that it could help others avoid the same fate." Tyler nodded. "And it's helping. There's a pilot project now in Washington, another in Northern California. None of them are perfect, but we're learning. And it all started here, with a man and a tree and a choice." As they returned along the snow-covered trail, Sarah lagged behind for a moment. She looked at the tree once more, memories of her father flooding her mind. The distant man of her childhood, always smelling of sawdust and diesel, always too tired for games or conversations. The embittered man of the bankruptcy years, who pushed everyone away with his anger. And the man of recent years, still rough at the edges, but softened by something like wisdom, who only called to chat, who asked about her life, who knew the names and interests of her children. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, "for showing me that it's never too late." The snow was falling harder now, beginning to blanket the trail. Sarah turned and followed the others, leaving the tree alone in the silent forest. But not entirely alone. Birds nested in its branches. Small mammals sought shelter in its roots. Fungi and lichens grew on its bark. It was an entire ecosystem, a world in miniature, alive in ways Marcus had spent his whole life without truly seeing. And it would continue, through seasons and years, through storms and droughts, through changes no one could have predicted. The bronze plaque would eventually turn green with oxidation, the words worn but still legible. People would come to visit it, some knowing the story, others simply admiring a beautiful tree in a tranquil forest. The tree knew none of this, of course. It knew nothing of documentaries or fundraising campaigns, or the man who had almost cut it down, but chosen not to. It simply continued doing what trees do, growing, reaching for the sun, transforming light and air and water into life. Simple, profound, eternal. Years later, when Tyler himself brought his children to see the tree, he told them the story of Marcus Thornwood. He spoke of a last day at work that should have been an end, but became a beginning. Of a man who learned that true strength lies not in tearing down, but in preserving. Of a choice made in a moment of clarity that reverberated through countless lives. The children listened with the partial attention of youth, more interested in climbing the nearby rocks and looking for squirrels. But something remained, planted in their young minds like a seed. Perhaps one day it would grow into understanding, into their own choices about what to destroy and what to preserve. The forest was silent, except for the wind rustling through the branches and the distant call of a raven. The tree stood motionless, an unwitting monument to a moment of grace, a chance seized when it could easily have been let pass. It was just one tree among billions. And yet, to those who knew its story, it was infinitely more. The sun set through the treetops, painting everything in shades of gold. Tyler gathered his children and began the walk back. He looked back one last time, seeing the tree silhouetted against the blazing sky, as firm and unchanging as the mountains beyond it. "See you later, old friend," he murmured, knowing that Marcus, wherever he was somehow still there. In the deep roots he had chosen not to uproot. In the sky-high branches he had decided not to cut down. In the life he had spared, and which in turn had saved him. This was the last day of work for a lumberjack that no one would forget. Not for what he destroyed, but for what he chose to leave behind. And perhaps, in the end, that is the only measure that truly matters. Not what we take from this world, but what we leave behind, growing strong and green and free under the endless sun.